All right. All right. Hi, everybody. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for attending. Given that the crowd's rather small, we'll kind of do this a little more informally, but roughly speaking, we're going to hear a short presentation on the housing production plan so far, and then we're going to break into a little exercise where we'll be bouncing around and doing a deeper dive on some of the information that's around the room on the boards. We will do some introductions given that we're a small size, and I think we got a good group here that would benefit hearing who you are and what board you're on. But I also want to introduce our consultants. So I'm Aaron Henry. I'm the town's Director of Land Use and Community Services. I staff the Affordable Housing Trust, which is our host this evening. And I want to introduce Jen Goldson, our consultant working on the housing production plan, and her colleague Noah Harper. Noah's from Texas. He brought the heat with him. So thank you. I know you all know it probably, but restrooms are right across the hall. We have some light refreshments. Please steal a cookie or water or something, so those don't all go to waste, although I know staff would love to see some leftovers tomorrow. But please make yourself at home. Danvers Cable Access is going to film the first part of tonight, and then when we break into the exercises, we will shut that feed down. So there'll be a short break when we're done with the first part of the presentation. So I think with that, we could do introductions. Microphones might not pick it up. Sorry for those watching at home or watching on YouTube later, but we'll do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll break into the presentation.
Yeah.
Okay. And I have an agenda. Does anybody need an agenda?
All right, that sounds great. And what I want you to do for your intro is tell us a little more than just your name and affiliation. I'd love to know what is one housing issue you have on your mind. It could be anything. So I hope that's a broad enough question. You came here to talk about housing. What's one housing issue you have on your mind? And if you want an extra challenge, try to say something that no one else before you said. Okay, that's just bonus points, okay? That might be hard. All right, so let's see. I'm just going to ask who wants to start because the first person will actually have it easiest because no one will have gone before them. And if you don't, okay, you go. And so we're going to go from this table back here, and then we'll go up to your table, and we'll kind of go around in a circle like that, all right? All right, so go ahead.
Thank you, Jen. For those that don't know, I'm Dan Bennett, Select Board member.
Oh, hold on, I'm sorry. You know what, I bet we could take that, the wire looks long enough, and just pass it around a little. People may have to stand up to, but then the cable will get it.
Good.
Good.
That's all you got.
That's all I got. That's all I need. So again, I am Dan Bennett, Chairman of the Select Board, member of the Select Board for 17 years. With Gardner Trask, number 12, 13 years ago, we looked at creating the Affordable Housing Trust, and I was just recently appointed as the Selectman Liaison to that trust. Prior to that, I served on the trust that we had, I can't remember the name of it, Affordable Housing. It really wasn't the trust itself, it was just a local community where we got involved in the housing folks from Peabody, and my memory is slipping a little bit, but we used to meet, issue funds for first-time home buyers, do the first-time home buyer program. We worked through HUD, giving grants out to Emmaus and other groups that had housing. So during that time, I would visit many different types of housing, veterans, single women, abused folks, the whole gamut throughout the North Shore. So I've been involved with that type of stuff.
That's great. And what's one housing issue
I've been advocating for accessory dwelling units
There you go.
by right, and the community has been slow to adopt that, but that's typical of Danvers. We're not early adopters. But
Right.
I think the state just passed some language that maybe we can look at and help.
They're trying, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, awesome. Thank you so much. So ADUs, accessory dwelling units. Next up.
Hi there, my name's Lou George. I am a member of the Planning Board. Recently been the chair of the Planning Board now. I've been on the Planning Board for 4 years. And so I also serve as a member of the Preservation Commission. and, town meeting member, and also, started my, as a member of the River Committee, which I'm still a member of. I grew up in town, and, in terms of sort of the area, in terms of housing, I mean, my, interest comes from this too, from even back when I was in school. I was a geography major in college, so studying urban planning and zoning and the like. In terms of the issues, sort of housing issues that I'm sort of, I guess that's an interest area or something. I know it's something that even in terms of the planning board we've dealt with is housing with respect to, as it relates to transit too. So I think that's an issue that I find just of interest in terms of housing in proximity to transit and ensuring.
Connection between where is housing located and what kind of transit services are nearby.
Right, and I know that's something that's an issue that affects a lot of areas. I mean, I lived in DC for a long time, and I know that's always been an issue that they struggle with in terms of transit, as well as sort of competing, between transit and parking and streets and all those sort of things.
Yeah, that's great. So that intersection of how that all works together. Awesome. Thank you. All right, next up.
Hi, my name is Jean Hartnett. I'm on the planning board. I have lived in Danvers for about 8 years. I did not grow up here, but I was on the Conservation Commission for a little bit, so getting into all the the commissions. My background is in civil engineering, but I also do a little bit of planning in my job, so I'm interested in all of this. One of my concerns for housing is just the prices and the availability. I know a lot of people my age and younger can't afford to buy houses anymore, just because the inventory isn't there and the prices are so high. Also, piggybacking off of what Lou said, I think that it's important to have access to transit near housing, and also just smart development where we see subdivisions going up all the time and all over the place, but that's not really a sustainable way to build housing, because you are going to run out of space at some point.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, that's great. So we've got, you talked a bit about like what I would call the starter home, stock of starter home that's affordable for, maybe young people to buy as their first home, that kind of thing, and the lack of availability, and also just that affordability issue. And yeah, that thinking about sustainability and how those traditional subdivisions just like eat up the landscape, and it doesn't make a lot of sense in a lot of contexts for that to continue. Yeah, thank you. All right, next up.
Well, I'm D. Joko. I'm one of the select board members, and it's fitting because you have the 70-year experience, but you also have the 1 month experience. So you have it on both ends. I don't know much about housing. I'm here mostly to listen, educate myself. The one thing I do know, though, is that my son had to move back home because he can't afford to live anywhere. So whatever we can do to help, that's what I'm here to learn. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. So similar to what you were talking about, kind of that entry level. All right. We might need to stand up after. We might not stretch any further than that. Go ahead.
I'm Carla King. I am on the Danvers Housing Authority Board, as well as the Danvers Affordable Housing Trust, as well as a town meeting member. And the housing issue for me is that we have truly affordable housing. I think when we talk about 80%, that's not affordable. I don't think $2,600, including nothing for a 2-bedroom, is affordable for most families. So that's my biggest concern, and that's why I've been around as long as I have, hoping and working hard for that.
Yeah, thank you, Carla. Yeah, so having that truly affordable, that 80% low-income housing, what does that mean for people who can't really afford that level? It's still too high.
My name is Lisa Silva. I am on the Danvers Housing Authority. I am on the Affordable Housing Trust, and I'm a town meeting member. I grew up here. I moved away for a while. I came back with my 2 kids. Got into Danvers right before this craziness started. I'm a real estate appraiser for a job. So one of the things that, of course, affordability, but for me, it's really the lack of inventory that we're seeing right now that is causing the prices to really increase at a rate that is just out of control. Coupled with the rates, it's like for a young person like your son to afford, or my younger brother, I mean, every time they save money, it's like the prices go up a little bit more. They're getting close to 20%, never get there. So I think that can be solved with like a lot of different types of housing instead of, we have a lot of single families in Danvers. And then we have, some big apartment complexes, but we don't have a good mix of all different types of housing for first-time buyers, for young families, for people who are aging out of their home and, they're in a big house, they want to downsize. So we have to think about adding inventory in a smart way that sort of speaks to all of our residents or people who want to live here.
That's great. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, so that concept of supply and demand, right? We haven't been building enough housing for many, many decades, just the whole region. It's not Danvers, it's the whole region, the whole state, the whole Northeast. And so everybody's feeling that pressure. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Corinne Doherty. I am on the ZBA and Preservation. I have lived in Danvers for 30 years. My husband has lived here almost his whole life. I agree and I echo what other people have said about the types of housing that we have. I think we have to be more mindful of the fact that even though there's kind of this push right now for a lot of apartment complexes, as you stated, we kind of need to look at it holistically. We need to offer apartments, but also condos for first-time home buyers and people who want to downsize, and also maybe go back to the Woodville kind of type of housing where it's smaller, not big homes, and that way all people will have the opportunity for that American dream.
Yeah, Corinne. Yeah, great points. And some people call that like a gentle density or a missing middle housing where you're, it's not just about only single family or only big apartment complexes, but there's so many different pieces in between that you can do. And I don't know the Woodvale development, but I get what you're saying, that they were smaller, a little bit more modest, right? Got it. Campanelli, got it. Okay. All right, who's up next?
Hi, I'm Ken Javanen. I'm on the ZBA, and so I'm also for affordable housing in all different, like single units, 2-family, maybe dual, like different sizes where a couple could live with like a couple kids, and then but also studio type for like young people starting off like your son, Ken, but also keeping with the integrity and charm of the town too. I just don't think we should run amok and build grandiose, complexes without. It has to be situated nice. In a way that it just keeps the integrity of the town, I believe. So,
It was a Ken? I couldn't hear what you said. Ken? Okay, good. Yeah, Ken. I love that, thinking about design and context and the integrity of your built environment. All right, who's up next? Come on up.
I think most people know me. John Bowner I'm the chairman on the zoning board of appeals. Been doing that for about 15 years. I've been in Danvers for about 35. I think the most things I'm interested in is trying to understand the ever-changing housing market, because I think of back when I first purchased my home here in Danvers, the interest rates were super high, and there seemed to be, reasonable prices that allowed me to enter the market and be a homeowner. And it's really hearing not only the stories here tonight, but just in general, it seems like a lot of people can't enter the market right now. I think the other thing, I think Ken touched upon it a little bit, is, you know, we're all aware of the huge project downtown, and I think there's more coming. And I've talked with Brian about this. I think we kind of lack design standards, which I think would help keep the charm and feel of Danvers. I don't know if we're too late to the party to fix that, but I guess I'd like to see that happen. And, you know, I am concerned that all of a sudden we're going to have, you know, a glut of housing. You know, maybe some of these developments even go under because they can't get people in them, so. But that's what I'm interested in. Thanks.
Great, thanks. John, it was John, right? Yeah, that's great. So the market dynamics, those ever-changing market dynamics, and how, you know, incomes for many decades haven't kept pace with the housing costs, so that's what you're feeling. All right, did we get everyone? We didn't get,
Well, staff.
oh, staff. We don't want to hear from you guys. Okay. All right, good. Well, I'm Jen Goldson, planning consultant. I have a planning consultant firm in Boston. We're based out of Roslindale. We've been in business almost 18 years. I go by the age of my youngest child, who just turned 18. And we do a lot of work with communities who are looking to produce housing in a way that's in character and in keeping with the way the community's developed, and thinking about things like gentle density and design is right up our alley. So I'm glad that some folks mentioned that. We do a lot of work with housing production plans as well as housing trust work in terms of action plans, and we also work with communities on bigger engagement kind of activities, comprehensive plans, things like that. So Noah and I are happy to be here, and I'm not going to talk too long. Noah's really going to go through, he's put together a presentation. We took a real deep dive into the market dynamics, as well as just trying to understand the trends that Danvers has seen. And Noah just took some pieces of that. We have a whole big report about it, but he's just going to give you the highlights of it. And then we have, as Aaron already mentioned, we have all these interactive boards around the room. So after the presentation, we'll just invite you to wander the boards and put your thoughts down, and then that'll be the night. So thanks for being here, and I'll be here all night. But Noah, you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Well, hey everyone, thank you so much for coming out tonight to hear the presentation, and really looking forward to the discussion after we talk. And this is the kickoff of the engagement phase of the plan. So we've done our homework, we've done our research, did a lot of looking at census data and market studies. And now we're trying to show it and tell it in a way that is more like a story than just dry tables. So I hope that comes across. And the next phase of that is to get the residents' feedback and input. Did we get stuff wrong? Or does this not make sense with how you experience it on the ground? Or maybe it does and you'd like to add more depth to it. So at the very end, after we have our discussion, we're going to take questions on the presentation, and hopefully it'll be more wide-ranging than that. We'll talk about this activity, and it's all about getting your feedback so we can incorporate that into the plan. We'll spend a lot of time looking at it, summarizing it, sharing it back with the trust and staff, and making sure we got it right. But let's start by talking about what a housing production plan is. Next slide, please, Jen. I like to think of it as a community-driven document that talks about your needs and strategies. It's also a state-designated plan with its own regulations. Next slide, please. And it comes with a few statutorily defined pieces. There's the housing needs assessment, which we're doing tonight. There's development constraints, which we'll talk about near the end of the presentation, which is, okay, well, we need to build some housing, and maybe that's affordable. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But where should it be? What are the environmental constraints to that? Zoning as well. And then local capacity. What's your staffing capacity? What are the organizations in the area that can be partnered with? And my favorite part is after that. We get to goals and strategies, where we talk about what we've learned. We look at the input, and we get together and think about ways to move forward that are actionable and realistic and time-bound and all of that good stuff. Next slide, please. So I took a look at your last HPP, which was back in 2014. It's this one right here. Part of it, going to the very end of the HPP, the goals and strategies, there's a map of land in Danvers that's given up for potential affordable housing development. This is part of what the state requires, is to say, here are some pieces of land where we're going to build stuff. And I wanted to, next slide please, Jen, just hone in on a project that I saw to illustrate how these plans can create stuff, how it can lead to actual brick and mortar units for people. Next slide, please. So just paging in on this project, which I believe is over on Conifer Hill Drive. This land was mentioned in the last plan and may have even been under construction. This is a Google Street View from about 10 years ago. Next slide, please. And so now we have real affordable units. These are subsidized units between, I believe, 30 and 60%, about 80 affordable homes that as part of the plan. So it's not just because of the plan that they came together, but this is something that helps to push for things like this for real affordable housing in the town. Affordable housing like this gets listed, next slide please, on your subsidized housing inventory. The housing policy wonks like us talk about the SHI a lot. It's a state number that is based off this 10% requirement, that 10% of your housing units be listed on the inventory. The idea was the state wanted to spur affordable housing development, particularly in towns where it had been almost impossible to get something planned. It's where, if you've heard of 40Bs, friendly and unfriendly ones, a lot of towns are trying to get above that 10%. It lets you have a little more say in what can and can't be built. Next slide, please. So these units over on Conifer Hill Drive are on your subsidized housing inventory. They get listed on there, and right now you're above the 10% threshold, which is a good thing. It means you have a little more say in how things get built. A developer can't come in and build something just because it qualifies under this state law. But a really exciting thing, at least for me, is the SHI is a list of where the affordable housing is in your community, and it's a way to benchmark it, to think about where we are today and where we can go. And the next slide shows you're a little bit over 10%, 10.06% right now, 1,100 affordable homes. Though some of these, I'm going to get really into the weeds here, some of them are not affordable. Under Chapter 40B, if your development is 25% of the units are subsidized, you can count all of them. There's a great resource called Housing Navigator, and they have a sort of true subsidized list. And your truly affordable units are about half that. So I've got my 1,100 number that the state really likes. That's good on paper. But in terms of affordable units, you're at about 500. And in a little bit, we're going to get into housing needs and just think about how that goes with incomes and ability to pay for stuff. Well, we're going to dive into the housing needs assessment first with demographics. Next slide, please. We like to look at projection data. UMass Donahue, they have a great sort of model that thinks about land use, it thinks about fertility rates, about economics, about where places are growing and changing, and gives you a ballpark for how much they think you're going to grow. And if you're at about 27,000 people, you're projected in the next 15 years by 2040 to get up to 30,000. But I think the real headline with this is a plateauing, a leveling off. And in the next slide, we'll look at the age brackets and how those are expected to change. Looking backwards for a second, 2012 are my navy bars, and then 2022 are the brownish ones. That's our most recent year we have census data from. I think the story of this is a general shift to the right, which means you have an aging population. Middle-aged folks getting older, seniors staying here. This really tall navy bar moving a little bit to the right in that 10-year span. So you have folks getting older. And when you look over here on the left-hand side, in terms of these brown columns, there are not as many younger folks coming in to fill in the gap. So over time, thinking about who's going to be living in Danvers as that population broadly levels off. Next slide, please. In terms of household composition, I think the big story here is that one to two person households make up over 50% of your overall households. So we often think of the American conception of housing with a lot of rooms, with a big house with a lawn. But most of your households, a significant part, are 1 to 2 person households, and they're expected to increase. There's been a little bit of a decrease in average household size. I think it's on one of these more, and we'll have some more data to look at after the presentation, but going from 2.5 people on average 10 years ago to 2.4. So it's just a slow shrinking. Next slide, please. At the same time as the households have been decreasing, incomes have been increasing. The big thing that I noticed here when I first saw this was this really tall brown bar on the far right. That's a huge spike in the number of households earning more than $200,000 a year, just in that 10-year period. when we start to look at housing prices, I think that the narrative there starts to become apparent of who's able to buy into the community. Next slide, please. This is another highlight that we enjoyed learning about, which is the census tracks where workers come and where they go and which workers live in the community. And you have roughly a 2-to-1 ratio of 2 times as many people come into Danvers for work as leave. And our 2,000 folks who live and work in the community. I know Aaron's one of them. When we think about growth in the economy and how housing fits into all of that, I think knowing what your job ratio is really important to that. Many towns we work in, it's completely opposite. Most towns that we work in, a lot of suburban towns where we have a lot of people leaving for work, and I think Danvers is unique in that way. And compared to Salem and Peabody and other surrounding towns, you guys have a higher ratio, which is pretty interesting. Yeah.
Just a quick question. Does this take into account, like, particularly post-COVID, myself included, people who work in Danvers, but their office is elsewhere, they're working remotely?
That's a great question. This is 2020 data, so the census was doing it right when that was happening. So I would reckon that does not take that into account. So we're looking at 2020, and everything, all of our data has a little bit of a lag time on it, which I'll try to just make clear. So, but great question. All right, next slide, Jen. We also took a look at the monthly wages of folks that work in Danvers. These aren't necessarily people who live in Danvers, but people who work here at your truck drivers, your teachers and carpenters. What are they making at the median every month? And the median, just to explain it, is that 50% number. 50% people make more than that. 50% of my carpenters are making less than that per month. But it's a better way than averages, which can kind of be a little screwy to draw conclusions for. But again, we'll get to this in just 1 second with housing costs, thinking about how much people earn, how much they should be paying to paying for their housing, and whether or not it's possible to buy into the community. Next. All right, next slide, please. One of my favorite things with this kind of work is learning about how a place grew, how it came about. I, in my master's program, studied transit-oriented development, so I was really into that transportation and development connection. And learning about the story of Danvers. You're a really old historic community with a lot of really great old housing stock. And this is a map of everything that was built before 1940, so before the car really became king, just as it was starting. I think it's really interesting to notice how compact everything is, how clustered it is. It's from when we primarily walked to work, or you took the train lines, or maybe you rode a horse. And then people working in agriculture would be a little bit farther out, but in general, Danvers was a pretty compact place. Got this, I believe it's the Rebecca Nurse Homestead. And then as we go one slide ahead, Jen, you can see as the car becomes more commonplace, we start to spread out a little bit. We start to build out roads. We don't build quite so compactly, and we start to have different kinds of housing. Next slide, please. And there's really a huge boom in this. From 1940 to about 1980 was a huge boom in this kind of building in Danvers. The land slowly gets eaten up, as Jen was saying earlier. Next slide, please. Continuing into 2000. Then as I looked at the data, I thought there was a subtle shift here. As your community becomes essentially built out, there's no more agricultural land to build a subdivision on. I know you have a few going on, but that stops to be the predominant way. And then in the next slide, you start to see multifamily housing popping up in more interesting places, particularly along the I-95 corridor. But thinking about how housing originally developed, how people got around, I think is really important as we eventually brainstorm solutions. Next slide. Simply a graph showing age of housing just in a fun, like, unit number term. The headline for me is just that a significant portion of Danvers was built after 1940. And you have so much great historic housing stock, but you also have a lot of stuff that was built after that, when folks weren't walking around quite so much, when we were driving our cars to get around. Next slide, please. This is another way to maybe tell the same story, thinking about housing density, the number of homes per acre. So we get into our mapping software and we divide the number of homes on a lot divided by the size of the acre. And you can see a similar pattern to that compact development when we were building in walkable places, maybe near a train station or where the jobs were. And then it slowly expands, a lot of lower density suburban neighborhoods. And for me, it was interesting looking at the I-95 corridor where you can see some of those newer multifamily projects have been popping up. Those really dark green specks over there, like the redevelopment of Danvers State Hospital. Next slide, please. Part of the fun too was looking at housing stock, going into some old databases and finding when things from 1600 or 1700 were built. And really cool that you can find such disparate housing types all across the community. My particular thing I like to do is find old multifamily. I go and like to trawl around in Google Maps. This blue house right here is a 3-family home. I think that's not too far from town center. But a range of housing types in the community. Next slide, please. I want to also call out subsidized housing that Danvers has, particularly units that are deeply affordable and appear on the subsidized housing inventory. Oh no, I lost my... Thank you. Appreciate it. Next slide, please.
You done with this one?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. Other thing that's really interesting for me about your community, most towns that are a little farther out in the suburbs have one kind of housing, which is detached single family. You have a really great mix, about 60% one unit detached over here, this big navy portion, but 3 and 4 units, 2 families, duplexes, going all the way up to 50 plus. Really cool to see that range, and as we were talking in our intros about housing types and options, you have a foundation for that already in the community. Next slide, please. In terms of tenure, Danvers is a town primarily of homeowners. 70% of people own their home, about 30% rent. That's higher than the state and both the county. Next slide, please. And I'd like to touch a little bit on housing production, on how growth is changing. We've been doing this exercise in a few different communities, thinking about the percentage of growth in housing numbers versus the percentage of growth in new households. So people are growing, the number of people are growing, but the number of units are not keeping up. And in terms of supply and demand, those two things causing a pressure, causing a shortage, and shooting prices higher. So Danvers is similar, unfortunately, to the state and both the county, and not producing enough housing to keep up with the number of households that want and need to live in the community. Next slide. I wanted to ask, can anyone guess for me the median price, the going price for a 2-bedroom apartment in Danvers last year? 2,800. Any other guesses? 3,000. All right, Jen. Oh, do you hear another guess? 25. All right, let's reveal it. 2,800. So you, sir, were right on the mark. Okay, here's the harder one. Median price for...
No, we need some kind of prize.
We do need a prize. I need a little... You get all the cookie. You get all the cookies. Can I get a guess for the price of a median single-family home in 2023? 650? You guys are on it. All right, Jen, reveal. Just about that, 670. Unfortunate, too high. Whoopie pie and the cookies. Okay. Thanks, guys. Yeah.
The Globe said the average price now in the Boston area went to $690.
Yeah, and this is a little last year's number, so it's only going up, and is not abnormal. Yes. So the average is going to be higher too. This is median, so 50% or lower, 50% or higher. Yeah. So when you have high numbers, that really pulls it up even higher in terms of averages. Anywho, next slide, please, Jen. So we do some math and figure out how much you should be making to be able to afford to rent in a place. And we do this for ownership too, and how much folks are actually earning. What we found is that the typical household in Danvers can afford that $2,800 apartment. And by afford, we mean you're not paying more than 30% of your gross income on rent, which is maybe not advisable, maybe not the greatest thing to be paying 30% of all your income on rent, but HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, defines that as kind of the cutoff for something called cost burden, which we'll touch on in a second. So if you're the typical household in Danvers, you can maybe afford that, at least people who are in that 50% and above. The folks on the other end of the spectrum, the other half, might be having trouble. The problem is our renters tend to always earn significantly less. So the typical household in Danvers is making about $116,000. The typical renter household is earning about $72,000, which means that $2,800 figure becomes really tough. And that's the $1,800 right there, is what they could pay at that 30%. So there's like $1,000 difference between these two figures. And next we ran the numbers for housing affordability. There's our actual median single-family sales price in December of 2023, so even closer to our $690 right there. A similar thing, if the housing market was rational and normal and it was easy for people to buy into, homes would be $375,000 and your typical Danvers resident could buy into that at $116,000. Unfortunately, there's a gap, a $300,000 gap between that affordability level with your mortgage and what you need, and you need to earn $200,000. And when we think about that huge influx and people earning over $200,000, I think it could be some people just getting promotions and doing better in their jobs, but it could also mean only a certain kind of people can buy into the community, and you're seeing an influx of those folks because it's just so expensive. Next slide, please. Just to sum it up, our median income, this is back in 2022, so I've got an inflation-adjusted number over here when we look at the boards. But typical household, 116, renters, significantly less, 72, and then that number to be 216. Next slide. The problem then when we think about who's working here and what they're earning is how you get to the rental affordability number is one thing, but the ownership thing is just becomes impossible. You need to have a high earning spouse, or you both need to be high earning, or you need 4 roommates, or it just becomes impossible to rent or live in the community. And this is not just unique to Danvers, this is happening all over our region, in almost every town and city. Next slide. Again, just focusing in on cost burden, so as a sort of diagnostic of where are the people who are struggling immediately today in the community that live here but are paying too much of their income on housing, that 30% number. Next slide. I'm going to introduce a wonky term called AMI, Area Median Income. I was telling you just about what people in Danvers were earning. We measure it also in terms of the whole region, right? Because Danvers isn't isolated on its own. People who work in Cambridge or Boston live here too. And there might be jobs that earn significantly higher there. So the area income is even higher. I believe it's in the 140, 150 range. And then we measure people who are struggling based on where they fall on that scale of income. Are you extremely low income, which is between 30%, very low income, moderate income, and then that 80%. Next slide. I took the trouble to translate it into just dollar amounts because I think it's easier than trying to do math in all of our heads. These are our households who live in Danvers today, who are either moderately cost burdened, which is at 30%, they're paying more than 30% of their income towards housing, or they're severely cost burdened, which means they're paying over 50% of their income on housing, so which is extremely inadvisable. And typically in most towns we see a lot of people at the bottom range struggling. I was really interested to see that people in your low middle range, the 45 to 75, let's call it, being the largest bar there. And next slide, I added up just the numbers of here are your households, and here's the range that are paying too much in housing, that are really precariously positioned. And the biggest ones being that 1,000 over in this middle income area, this middle to low income area. All told, it's almost 3,000 households in an 11,000 household community. So it's about a third of residents of neighbors are really struggling with housing costs today as HUD measured it. And I think this is a conservative way to measure it. Wanted to touch briefly on how did we get here. I think we talked about supply and demand and the introductions. That's a big part of it. The other idea that I've been thinking about a lot recently is the idea that Strong Towns published a book called Escaping the Housing Trap. And it talks about this dynamic between we want affordable housing, but it's also the primary way that we build wealth in this country. We want those housing numbers to go up because that's my nest egg, that's my retirement. and having the sort of intractable problem of balancing those two things when we need housing to go up because we need that for the future, but we also need something for our neighbors here and now. Next slide, please. And Danvers has been building. We had a fun community tour back in April and walked around the town center, learned about some cool new zoning initiatives and mixed-use buildings. The question is whether that will be enough and whether there will be enough subsidized housing to complement it for the third of families that are struggling here today. Next slide, please. I mentioned a little bit about development constraints, the environmental and zoning obstacles to building today. Next slide. Thanks. I think a primary one that pops out immediately are wetlands. The idea that there's a whole lot of parts of Danvers that just are not advisable or not legal to develop. There's the Wetlands Protection Act. There's common sense reasons to not be building where there are wetlands in the community. The next environmental constraint are flood zones. And this is just today not taking into account climate change and sea level rise, but where FEMA says there's a 1% or 0.2%, those floodplains. So those being really obvious ideas and regulatory barriers, to not build housing. The other one is a little more interesting, at least to me. I'm a nerd about zoning and love to look at the zoning maps and think about what is this framework that we have for how we should grow in the community. Danvers has quite a lot of the area is zoned for single family homes, and then you get a little closer and you allow duplexes, and then this little purple section is the cool character-based zoning districts that's relatively new for you guys with a form-based code and a little more focus on design rather than how many people can live in a structure. Next slide, please. We did another diagnostic on your zoning code and said, it says a parcel should be this wide, this long, it should conform to this on the piece of paper. We can then measure the parcels in actuality and say, does it conform with what the zoning code says? Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Totally, and it's the same in almost every town where it was built up and people were okay with it, and then a lot of zoning was copy pasting from each other and not really thinking about the character and the context of the community. So a good chunk of Danvers, I have this in my slide notes, I think it's 88% is not compliant with what it says on that piece of paper. And for my ZBA friends in the room, that means a whole lot of extra cases that you get to deliberate on and hear about that may relate to housing production in some way or another. I pulled out, next slide please, Jen. Just one example, I hear about EFLAs a lot, the extended family living areas. I love the idea of you can build an extra dwelling that's attached or in your backyard for a blood relative or a family member. The problem is, if my lot isn't dimensionally compliant, I then have to go to the ZBA, I have to do my notice, I have a little extra work. And when I think about my parents, if they'd be willing to do that, maybe for my sister to move back home, I wonder if the burden becomes a little too high for that. Next slide, please, Jen. So when we talk about missing middle, smaller scale things about local people building and shaping the community, these kinds of discrepancies in the regulations and the things that we might want to see down the line and might be identified in this and maybe not, can have a big difference, particularly at this small end of the scale where I think the truly interesting and great places get built and so many of the great architecture and structures in your town came from. Next slide, please. I think in summary, the headlines are pretty simple. Your population is going to grow a little bit and it's going to flatten out. Your households are going to get a little bit smaller, and they've already been decreasing, and you already have 1 to 2 family households being over half of everyone in Danvers. Lower birth rates too. And there's a mismatch maybe between the kind of housing we were building after 1940 of a house with more bedrooms than maybe are necessary, a lot of square footage and acreage, or a lot of land outside of it, and maybe what people need today, and more importantly, housing that's more land efficient and economical for residents and workers who are struggling already, or maybe you want to buy in and be a part of Danvers today. Next slide, please. So that's it for our high-level bits and pieces, and I think we're going to publish the long PDF of this on the town planning department website so you guys can look through it and send more comments your way, because this is the community engagement phase where we want to hear more from you and learn about aspects that might have been missed or we'd like to see more of. But I'd love to take any more questions you all have, and then
Actually,
a little...
Noah, if I could just interrupt for 1 second. Before you take questions, it might be good to tell people what's around the room.
Yeah.
Because the way we're going to capture comments and thoughts are in these boards around the room.
Yes.
So I think the questions would be great if you have questions about the content of the presentation. And then your thoughts and ideas can go around the room. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also a caveat with this is we have an online survey that's launching today for everyone who wasn't here to make it. And over at the table where you walked in are a bunch of little postcard-sized flyers with a code and a link to give to people. So really encourage everyone, if you can, to share that. I'll just explain this and then take questions about the presentation. These are designed to get as much information as we can from you all. There's a few catch-all ones, like what is at the heart of the matter for Danvers here at the beginning, explaining what is a housing production plan. Then we want to learn more about your demographics. Where are you from in the town? Maybe you don't live in Danvers at all. How old you are, things like that. Then there's a few sort of data slides that are similar to the data I talked about, but looking at it in a different way, and you can learn about how Danvers changed in the last 8 years since your last housing production plan. Then a few boards over here on former housing strategies, which are the ones that were in there, and we ask folks to rate how you agree with them. Do you think these were effective? Some of them have been completed, some of them haven't, and that's really helpful for us when we think about the new ones at the end of this plan. And finally, a few boards here at the end where we have sticky notes provided for ideas and feedback. Mostly, one is about challenges and one's about opportunities. What are the housing challenges and what are the housing opportunities? And that's supplemented by a board with just a map on it and some stickers and putting down particular locations where you say, oh, this would be contextual and appropriate for us to build more housing right here. And you can write in below too if you want to give more detail. Last but not least, just a board on our project schedule where we are, the survey and what the housing production plan is ultimately building to. But okay, those are my instructions. I'd love to have presentation questions now. Maybe I'll start with you, sir, because I saw your hand up first.
No, you confirm that we're at 10.6% affordable housing according to the census. But then you said that actually there's only 500 truly affordable units. Would you explain that?
Yeah. So I'm going to get a little into the weeds here with Chapter 40B. It's a state law designed to help build more affordable housing. But there's kind of not quite a loophole, but there is a part of it that says if your development has at least 25% affordable units, so 75% don't have to be affordable, we'll put them all on the list. We'll count those all on the SHI. So not all of the lists not all of the units in that 10% are affordable. A good chunk of them, nearly half, are actually market-priced ones, kind of masquerading as affordable. So I look at another data source by having Housing Navigator, and they have the actual listing of the units, which is in the 500 range.
So I guess maybe just to give a little color, so like...
Yeah.
Aaron, could you talk into the mic?
Yeah, sorry. I think a good example of this is, so I'll call it DHCD, although now it's EOHLC, HLC, Housing and Livable Communities. So back in the day, there was a desire from the Commonwealth to see rental housing produced. So they have a incentive. They give us, as Noah said, 100% of the units. So at Danvers State Hospital, only 25% of those units are affordable as defined by the state. But because it was a rental property that the state continues to incentivize, communities that host those types of developments receive 100% of those units on their SHI. So we're at 10.6%. with 1,000 or 1,100 and whatever that number was, but in the case of that particular development, only 25% of the 400 units up there are actually affordable. So it
Rentals only?
rentals
Rentals only.
Rentals only.
Yeah.
rentals
Yeah.
only. So you saw throughout the teens, the communities I've worked for before Danvers, if we were going to see a 40B or we had heard rumblings of a 40B, it was almost always encourage the developer to do a rental as opposed to ownership, because we'd have a community benefit
Yeah.
if they did that. The bad news is at the end of the day, have you really accomplished what Ms. King wants to see is truly affordable housing? The answer is no, because 75% of those units in that one particular development are actually market rate units.
Yeah.
So it's,
You fend off a 40B.
yeah, you've accomplished what you needed to do as far as the unfriendly 40B coming in and being deposited in a place that you think might not be, beneficial to the community. But if you're looking at an affordability standpoint, you're failing.
And like Carla, I disagree with 40Bs only building at 80% of the market rate.
Yeah.
There really needs to be
Yeah.
a greater number of 60,
Absolutely.
30 for that single parent that can't afford.
There is a
Yeah.
wrinkle to 40Bs at, if they include, they only have to include 20% instead of 25 if they go to a deeper subsidy, if they go down to 50% AMI, but
They don't.
they don't. Correct.
Yeah, and it's a really good point in this chart that Noah presented a few slides ago, showing who is really struggling in Danvers to afford their current housing. You can see that it justifies exactly what you just said. If you look at that 50 to 80, or is it 60? Hold on, I got to go back. If you look at the 50 to 80% AMI, which I like to see the incomes too, you still have people struggling. It's over 500 households. But if you look at the next one down, which is, what is it? 30 to 50% AMI, you have a lot more people struggling. A lot of, almost 500 are just paying half of their income toward housing costs. So you feel that intuitively in the community, and the data bears that out.
And if I may, it's not just renters.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm a real estate agent. I did not disclose
Yeah, this is
that really.
everybody. Yeah.
But it's
Everybody.
Yeah.
There are areas in town with high-priced homes and people with big mortgages at 50%, and heaven forbid, one of the parents loses their job, those folks are in big trouble.
Yeah, they're at the top bar right there, those 50 maybe. Oh, right there. And then I'm going to come over here.
State mandate or state guidelines.
Yeah.
Is housing, is it tied to funding from the state?
Yeah, I think as related to that 40B mandate, it is more a requirement that then developers can come in and build. But you guys are over,
I understand
yeah.
that, but you mentioned at the top of your talk about the state guidelines, I thought.
Oh, yeah.
Not to do with.
I think it's about
Yes.
the housing production
Yeah.
plan itself.
Is that tied to funding to the town of Danvers?
It's more tied to another way to kind of push away unfriendly 40B developments. So if you certify this plan and you say we're going to build 0.5%, I think, of your total units every year, and you do that, the state will give you a check mark. And so if you're under that 10%, you still have a way to keep development that maybe isn't within the character way. But I don't believe the state gives any incentives for meeting your 10%, but Jen could prove me wrong.
Yeah, there's some grants that you can get kind of more points toward your application, so you can be more competitive.
Yeah.
But you don't get direct funding because of the HPP, because of the housing production plan. The bigger benefit is that if you do fall, well, I think the bigger benefit is you're being thoughtful about your housing needs and how you want to address it. But if you look just at the state mandate and 40B, the benefit there is that if you do fall under the 10%, which you're very close, if you lost a few units,
7 units.
yeah, you could dip right down. And this plan, if you show some incremental production, you don't have to get back up to the 10%. You got to just show some incremental production. The ZBA would then, with a certified plan by the state, would have more authority to deny or impose other conditions that it normally can't on a comp permit.
Does this count show the units that are about to come online?
I was just gonna.
Oh, does Aaron have a?
Oh, what's in the pipeline? Yeah. This is an Aaron question.
No, that's an excellent point, and we were just chatting. That number at 10.6 does not yet include Maple Square. The state has all of the paperwork that they need, so we're just waiting on them. they're willing, well, anyway, we got some of the stuff out of the state regarding Maple Square. They have yet to put it on the SHI. Earlier today, we were at New England Homes for the Deaf. That project's 116. Basically, that's a 75% inclusionary. That would come on, but we're not there yet. That won't be able to get on until we have building permits issued. But, so we have some projects in the pipeline that are very advantageous for us, but they're not, DHCD has not put them on yet.
And
HLC, sorry.
maybe on the state incentives thing, there is I believe the housing choice program, which if you have a certain, if you show production separate from all this, you'll get onto a list and I think get extra points and maybe in the running. The other thing is you have this thing called a 40R district, and at least on paper that gives you money for unit production and the state gives you incentives. Sometimes the state doesn't fund the program and so there's just no money to give, but the state is very slowly trying to do this. And I think in the bond bill that's coming up, there's a bigger push for infrastructure funding that goes alongside housing production to say, we're not just going to force you to build, but we're going to give you some money too to help with that growth and accommodate it. Cool. Okay, I know I had some questions down here in the front row. Yeah.
So my first concern about the presentation is you had talked about Conifer Commons and that my voice isn't big enough. So my first concern is when you talked about Conifer Commons and that them being subsidized and they're affordable.
Yeah.
Conifer Commons is not affordable on its own.
Okay.
It's only affordable because yet they have those certificates. There might be some that were affordable, but there are plenty there that are not affordable. So I just don't want the public thinking that all of Conifer Commons is affordable.
Sure.
And again, that's my goal, is to find affordable housing for our families. And you had also mentioned the low income. Absolutely, we need more housing for low income. But I'm still talking about affordable for the people who work in town, for the social workers, in town, for the teachers in town. So not just low income, but truly affordable for people who, are working those jobs in town and can't afford to stay in town.
Yeah, I saw Jen going back over to that. That was kind of a thought in this, is the working folks that are really struggling and are able to qualify for stuff.
And low income is definitely important for me, but but right now I really feel like we really need to concentrate on the affordable for the folks who work right in here in town. And then my other concern is the people who need to be here are not here. How was this put out to the public? Because I feel like the people who are consistently complaining about these things and really need to hear this and really need to give the feedback are not here. And maybe it's just because they're lazy and didn't come, but I really want to know how this was put out to the public, because there should be more people here. I'm very
Carla,
sad.
can I
think
answer
the
your-
people that are here, you're preaching to the choir. We get it.
Yeah.
So I'm really concerned that the public is not here.
Carla, can I just answer your first question first? So it's a really good point you make about the people who work here. We have the median income for a social worker. You mentioned social workers, 60,000, almost 60,500. You look at, middle school teacher, about 81,000. And I have it up on the slide here. And then if you flip over to the slide that shows the incomes in each bracket, you can see that those, that's a single person making that income.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the caveat. You could have a spouse or a roommate who's making more money, and then it puts you in a different category. But if you just look at the single person's income, like the social worker was 60,500?
Yes.
As a median, that puts you in that very low income category right here, which is that 30 to 50% AMI. So when we're talking about low income housing, the way we talk about it, it's everything under 80%. And so all those professions you just mentioned actually would probably be considered low income, even very low income, unless they live with a spouse or a partner who makes a lot more money. So that's the caveat. We don't have that level of detail on those example jobs, who they're living with. But so I agree. This housing, I think the need is really at that very low income in Danvers in particularly.
My concern with that
Particular.
is when you say that,
Yeah.
the general public views that as, maybe the mom on welfare. They don't view it as
Right.
the person working in town, the social worker, the teacher.
Right.
So when you say that, that's what the general public,
Right.
for the most part, view.
Right.
So I guess that's,
Yeah, no, I hear you, and that's exactly why Noah put I'll go back to it. This is giving me a little bit of a hard time here. But anyway, that's exactly why Noah put those sample, those sample, so that people really do understand, like, people who work in these jobs, full-time will qualify for this lower income housing, very low income, or extremely low income, depending on who they're living with. In terms of the outreach, correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron, did we do a mailer?
We need to push through the town manager's office,
Yeah.
shows up, but
Yeah, a push through the town manager's office? Yeah,
through social media.
yeah,
But-
social media, mhm.
I will say this is the kickoff of community engagement and not the end of it. And so after this is over, we're going to have another forum to talk about the draft goals and strategies and what we heard. So the bigger thing is getting that survey out to people, because we're trying to get all this same stuff, have that online, because people with jobs, it's hard to get out somewhere at 6:00.
And we do find, I think especially in the past few years, it's not unusual. Danvers is not unusual in the communities that we've worked with around housing issues. I think, people, I don't want to speak for everyone or generalize too much, but I do feel like people are less inclined to come out on even we do things on Saturdays or Sundays, we still struggle to get people like out of their regular lives and into a room like this. But we find that the digital engagement does much better in most communities. I can't promise you that it will here, but if you can help us get the word out, we find that people are much more likely to respond to something on their phone than to leave their kids with a sitter or, come out on a hot night or a cold night or a rainy night or a whatever night. It seems like people have other things they're doing with their lives and don't come out to these things as much. So I think it's kind of a general societal thing going on. I mean, unless there's like a super controversial, development proposal before the ZBA, then they'll come out. But if it's like an abstract thing that there's not something scary going on, we do find that not a lot of people come out. Yeah, I'm not saying it's right, but yeah.
Right.
Right.
When it blown up.
So my question you answered it a little bit, but not completely, so I'll just ask it anyway. So is there any way, or do you have any demographic information on the household sizes? So like you just talked about, if a social worker is living by themselves, right, that puts them in a much lower category. Also, age, just any demographic information, because if you go back to the one unit detached, right, 58% of our housing, which is a good portion of our housing, is one, and then a one-person household is 27%. So there's got to be people living in a detached single family, one person, right?
Yes.
I mean, so there's how much overlap is there is
Right.
kind of.
Yeah, we know how many, from this chart, we know how many single and two-person households there are. And then from the other chart that I just zoomed by, that's not next to this slide, so I'm not going to go back to it, but you saw it flash by. You have a lot of single-family homes.
Right.
We don't know who's living in which homes, in which
Right.
housing type, but we do know just from the ratio of
Right.
how many that there are a significant number of people living alone or
Right.
people living with one other person.
It's
It
just
could
interesting
be-
to me because,
Yeah.
like where I am in my life, I have two teenage boys and I'm a single mom. So we have a 3-person household, right? Most of the people that I know are pretty much in the same, like in town. I have a lot of people that I know that are in the same stage of life as me,
Right.
say. I don't know a single person that lives in a single family alone. But, yeah, okay, so, right, so that's what I'm saying, is like, do we have any idea of, what I mean, so that we can find solutions for that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
we
like an
don't
age
know-
and place, thing
Yeah,
where, and I understand, people who have owned their house for a long time, raised a
Right.
family, their kids have moved on, maybe their spouse has passed away, and they don't want to move out of Danvers. They want to
That's
stay
right.
here,
Yeah.
right?
That's what we see anecdotally in many communities where we're seeing this trend. It's that people who have been here a long time, like I have 2 kids and a husband, so right this very moment, I have a 4-person household, and we have a 4-bedroom, single family in Roslindale. But on August 27th, when both of the kids are going to college, I'm going to be a 2-person household.
Right.
In that 4-bedroom. And we're going to stay there because we want the kids to come home to the house they grew up in for a little while, and then we're probably going to sell it.
Yeah.
After a little while, because we don't really want to be 2 people living in that house forever with a million stairs. We have 4 different floors, and so I think that's what's happening. Just as I think I'm sorry, is it Dan? Yeah, Dan had mentioned there's a lot of people who have been here a long time. Maybe they raised a family here, maybe they didn't. We don't really know the specific details,
Right.
but we can deduce that many of them are probably in a similar situation to what I'm about to see in my own life. And teenage boys, they won't be teenage boys forever.
Right. I mean,
Right.
I may be that single person household in a single
Right.
family.
And you don't
pretty
want to
soon, right?
leave, and maybe your mortgage is mostly paid off or all paid off.
Right,
And maybe
right.
you can't find another unit that is desirable for you.
Right.
That's, downsizing.
Yeah, I was just kind of
Yeah.
thinking like, where is all of this? It's hard to really nail down. I know.
Yeah.
And also, just because like I'm a 3-person household, but there's only one person making an income in my
Yes,
how,s right?
exactly.
So that doesn't necessarily mean, in these numbers don't necessarily reflect how many people are earning money.
Correct.
Yeah.
So it's I just think that having a big mix of housing would solve some of those problems, because I know there are a lot of people, older people, who don't want to sell their house only because they want to stay here. Like, they may not really want to take care of a big house, but what are their alternatives to downsize in Danvers? There are not a lot of alternatives, and especially affordable on a fixed income. They may be retired. They're probably retired, so
Right.
that's, I think, where that kind of all that mix of housing really comes in, that we don't. I know you said we have a foundation, and I agree, but I don't think
Not
there's
enough.
enough of
Not
a
enough.
mix. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think you're
Yeah.
interpreting the data exactly the way we are as
Right.
well. So you're right.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure you all have enough time to go around. We do have a lot of questions for you. Noah and I will be here, and Aaron and Brian and everybody at the staff table will stick around if you have questions, and we'll kind of roam around. We're happy to keep the conversation going, but I think this would be a good break. Aaron, did you have some wrapping up?
Nope.
Okay, good.
Oh, till Danvers TV. Yeah.
Oh,
And-
right, the cable access. Yeah, so thank you, and
Yeah.
and then we'll be collecting. Say goodbye to everybody at home that's watching, and we will basically collect what you're saying and create a little summary of what you said. So,
And I just ask, before you leave on that table by the door, there are a bunch of little postcard-sized things that say, take the survey, here's a link, here's a QR code. If everyone could take 3 or 4 of those and give them to someone. We want as much participation in this as possible.
and everyone